Koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai. Welcome to this webinar on the review into the future for local government. Ko Janine Dowding toko ingoa. I'm the lead for the Secretariat supporting the panel's work, and I'll be facilitating this webinar today. Before we begin, I'll ask Antoine to lead us in with a karakia.
E kia ora mai tātou. Tūtawa mai I runga, tūtawa mai I raro, tūtawa mai I roto, tūtawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. E mihi kawana kia koutou, ko tai tīnana mai kei wainganui a tātou, o tira ko te mea nui hi mihi kawana ki te whānau a tāmaki, o tira ko te nota, me ngā tara o Aoi. Just like to acknowledge all those whānau in Auckland, in the north and in the Coromandel at this time. Kia ora mai tātou.
Kia ora, Antoine. Thank you all for attending today. We have a very large group, we're delighted to say, and we absolutely appreciate the interest you're showing in the review and the time that you're taking to be with us. I'd like to introduce the panel. Perhaps we can take down the presentation for a moment so that we can see the panel. Here we are. We have Chair Jim Palmer, Gail Surgener, Brendan Boyle, Antoine Coffin and Penny Hulse. Now, I do need to alert you that this webinar is being recorded, and the way we'll be working the webinar today is that we will be providing a brief presentation which will cover the panel's draft report on the review into the future for local government, he mata whariki, he mata whanui, and then the panel will open up to questions. We'll have Jim and Gail leading us through the presentation, but the whole panel will be available to us, except for Antoine. I believe, unfortunately, that you need to be away at 1 p.m.
That's okay. I was going to be meeting with the bank at 1, but I've been delayed, so I'll be with everyone right through.
Right, okay. So I just want to point out the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That is the button you will need to use to ask any questions. And please don't wait. Feel free to load those questions in there as we go. We have a team collating the questions and we'll try to answer as many as we can, noting that in the time we have, we probably won't get to all of them, but be assured we will cover them off and come back to you with an email responding to those questions after the webinar. Please don't use the chat button to ask questions, but if you are having issues or technical issues, then use the chat button to alert our team and we'll see what we can do to help you. So with that, I think we'll get underway with the presentation. Let's wait for this to be loaded. Thank you, Caitlin. So next slide, please. So the review into the future for local government, we're running ahead a little bit now, but we'll briefly talk about the review, which was announced by the local government minister, then Minister Mahuta, and was a response to a call from local government to review the future of local government, given so many reforms that were occurring with quite significant impacts for local government. Next slide. This is the panel that I just briefly introduced, and I would say that this panel is amazing to work with. They have such a huge diversity in experience and a depth in thinking that is such a high value to this review. They are also incredibly committed to local government, a very strong belief in the importance of local government to communities. Next slide. A quick overview of the timeline here, and I just want to draw your attention mainly to the timeline for submissions, which will need to be in by the end of February, and the panel's report will be released on the 19th of June 2023. Now, the report will go to the local government minister and a working group will be set up of central government and the LGNZ to consider those recommendations. But given the timing of the report and elections, it is unlikely that any changes that required legislative change or large-scale change for central government any decisions around that would be made by the next government. Next slide, please. We mentioned that we have this webinar today is a series of webinar with a range of groups. It's just part of the engagement that the panel have undertaken. They have undertaken a massive amount of engagement. It's been very important to them. They've been absolutely committed to it, and what they have heard has very much come through into their thinking and into the draft report. Next slide, please. With this, I'll hand it over to Jim to take us through the report. Jim and Gail.
Kia ora, mai tātou, ngā mihi nui, tēnā koutou. Pleasure to be with you today, and Gail and I are just going to give a bit of an overview of the key themes that sit within our draft report. Probably important to note that our draft report is, while a draft, it's not a draft of our final report, and by saying that, things within our draft report pose a number of questions, and there are a number of opportunities to think about the system, and our panel thinking is still evolving. So our draft is not a draft of our final, and we think our final report will change. We see this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reimagine local government. As I say, our draft report traverses a broad range of complex issues, and we're really looking forward to your feedback and thoughts to help shape our third and final report. We see local government as playing a critical role in responding to the increasing complex challenges facing New Zealand. And it's clear that renewal and change is required to ensure that local government is ready and able to play that role. Major changes are needed both for local government and for central government. Next slide, please. Through the balance of this presentation, we're going to identify some of the key themes that have emerged through our thinking to date. And the first is about needing to revitalise citizen-led democracy. We think that there needs to be a rethink about how local government facilitates democracy, not delivers it. The challenges of the 21st century and the pace of change is causing many to lose trust in democratic institutions and to disengage. As the layer of government closest to community, local government holds the key to rebuilding trust and confidence in civil institutions. The challenge is that the current systems do not support local government to take full advantage of the important role it holds. We need more inclusive and innovative democracy practices. In many countries, participatory and deliberative democracy processes are regularly used to ensure that the widest and most representative group of voices are heard on key issues. We think that's a really important plank and change that needs to occur within the system of local democracy, and to ensure that those participatory and deliberative democratic processes are effective and embedded, it will require significant support for councils to put those, or from councils to put those into action. Next slide, please. Whilst strengthening local voice in local democracy is important, however, there needs to be greater work put into replenishing and building representative democracy as well. Elected members are critical, and we need to ensure that we have a diverse and capable members and governors. We also need to attract, support and value elected members who instill optimism and confidence in their communities, and who bring diverse perspectives, cultures and backgrounds. We need highly capable leaders and connectors with lived experience who can bring communities together and who are confident enough to make sound, long-term intergenerational decisions. We need upskilled elected members. This is not just about governance training, but upskilling in all areas, including cultural competence, community development, civic innovation, and connection to international best practice. Elected members also need to be adequately remunerated have decent and supporting work environments, and work well together as a team, and importantly with executive and staff. We are proposing a number of changes to the system around representation reviews, voting mechanisms, local government administration, the voting age, and the term of elected members being extended to 4 years. We're also posing thoughts about adding some capability-based and mana whenua appointments to supplement the existing representative democracy model, and we're very interested in your views and thoughts about those matters. Next slide, please. An important part of our consideration is how do we ensure that there is a totality-based partnership between Māori and local government. As a panel, we believe we need Te Ao Māori woven into everything we do with explicit recognition of totality. We aspire to see Te Ao Māori embedded in New Zealand's identity. The Māori worldview should be represented in legislation, systems and processes, and expressed in the governance, management and operations of local government. The treaty provisions of the Local Government Act are inadequate. A new legislative framework for the relationship with Māori is required, with more explicit recognition of Te Ao Māori concepts of well-being and governance values that are reflected in the purpose and principles of local government. Also, we think tikanga should be used in council meeting and engagement processes, making local government a safe space and a welcoming space for Māori to work in. Importantly, this all requires a major investment in the capacity and capability of local government, along with a national framework for increasing capacity for hapu and iwi to meaningfully participate. I'd now like to pass to Gail, who's just going to talk a little bit about well-being, roles and responsibilities and functions, and the relationship with central government. Next slide, please.
So in the draft report, we've looked at allocating roles and functions to local government in a way that enhances well-being. And we see that a whole new approach to how we value the role of local government and how we think about what local government can do is needed. Now, it's clear that complex issues like biodiversity loss or climate change, that we're experiencing the effects of that firsthand in Tamaki Makaurau at the moment. Other issues like loss of social cohesion, challenging economic conditions are not going to be solved with a separation of roles and delineation of roles that we might have had in the past. These challenges are too big for local government or central government to do on their own. And we also know that many of the solutions actually lie in communities and need to be solved locally and enabled locally. So this also introduces the concept of wellbeing councils of the future, where local government plays a greater role. We have the next slide, please. A greater role in grappling with these 21st century challenges. We see that local government could carve out a new role as champion and activator of local wellbeing. Wellbeing is in the purpose of local government, but it hasn't been fully realised. And we're suggesting that this role could be deepened to include local government as an anchor institution. That means doing all it can to leverage its purchasing power for wellbeing, or include local businesses in its supply chain, use its role as a big employer in a community for social wellbeing. Alongside that, the systems networker and convener role, where local government can champion the issues that matter to local communities, and as a placemaker, a role that local government does much of but could do even more. Wellbeing councils of the future will require new skills, perhaps new ideas and innovation, different ways of working, using resources and levers and the connections and relationships that local government has to generate more community and social value. To do that, we realise that there'll need to be much more partnering. So the next slide, please. And local government strengthening its partnerships with central government, with hapu and iwi, and local communities. And this may need some new arrangements, new institutions in order to support this. Local government can strengthen its anchor institution and facilitator roles at place and be that foundation partner for others that want to grapple with some of these hard issues for communities and attract co-investment and collective effort. This would be quite a change in the way that local and central government work together, where the strengths of both are leveraged with everything that they bring to the table. At the moment, we see probably too much parallel working and not the collaboration that these challenges require. So this leads on to the issue of funding, and that collaboration between local and central government will need to address some of these funding challenges, and I'm going to hand back to Jim to pick that up.
Kia ora, thanks, Gail. If we could just move to the next slide. Many have commented that we've reached peak rates, and there have been 16 previous reviews of funding and finance in local government, and many have generated recommendations. Sadly, few of those have been implemented. We think change is needed. Currently, unfunded mandates need to cease, and that's where government passes responsibilities to local government, sometimes significant responsibilities, without commensurate funding to support delivery of those mandates or services. Those unfunded mandates need to cease, and there needs to be funding provision for regulatory impacts that have national good benefit but are imposed on local government. So where those things are occurring and obligations are passed on to local government to deliver on behalf of the nation, then local government needs funding to support those new expectations placed on them. We also need a new approach to funding community outcomes and priorities. We see that if local outcomes and priorities are agreed between central government and local government and others such as hapu iwi, and there is sustainable central government funding available to support those local priorities, and its application is determined locally in partnership with key players at place, then we think significant change could occur, and this is needed. A lot has been said about rates and retaining rates. We actually think it's important to retain rates, and that's principally for local autonomy. That enables councils to decide what they are able to do and have a guaranteed source of funding and are not totally reliant on central government. However, we need to streamline and simplify the long-term planning and rating processes. Climate change is an obvious issue, and we're seeing the impacts as we speak. To address ongoing intergenerational challenges that come with climate change, we think there needs to be a substantial intergenerational climate change fund that is available to support and invest in the critical issues that our nation will face. So many funding challenges within the system, and many have noted that unless this element changes, then many other things will struggle to change that are needed. If we could go to the next slide, please. When we think about all of the issues that are coming for local government, the challenges of the future, and as I say, whether that's climate change, whether that's large social and economic equity issues, they are big challenging issues, and we think that there does need to be a review of the system and the way in which local government is organised. In our draft report, we've talked about this, recognising the very clear message that we've heard that we need to keep the local in local government while realising benefits of economy of scale and scope where relevant and appropriate. At this point as a panel, we don't have a firm view on what the future structure should look like. However, we have developed some design principles and examples that need to be present in any future system in our view, and we'd be really interested in your perspectives about this. In our view, the status quo isn't the sustainable option, and as I mentioned, we've developed 5 design principles and 3 examples of how those principles could be applied. In terms of the design principles that we think should underpin future structures, the first is that key issue of local. Keeping the local in local government is something which is essential in our mind. So any future system has to enable that and ensure that. Second, the second principle is around subsidiarity. That is, in particular, that decision-making is made at the lowest level possible. The third is that future local government entities need to be resourced. They have to be viable and have capacity to be able to respond to the challenges that are ahead of us. The fourth principle is one around partnership. The future system and structure needs to be flexible to enable such arrangements as council-controlled organisations, co-governance arrangements, and other partnership models which ensure entities can organise themselves and come together for best effect for communities. And the fifth principle is around the concept of economies of scope. Where skills and resources need to be combined, that should be enabled. So we've created 5 design principles that we're interested in feedback on as a basis of how to think about future system and structure. Following that, we've also outlined 3 examples within our report of how to give effect to those principles. And while I won't go into them now, essentially they are concepts of a unitary authority. A second option is, or example, is around a regional and having regional and local councils. And a third option is what we're calling a local combined authority model, which for those of you who are familiar with Greater Manchester, it looks very similar to those. There is more detail to be found around the principles and examples within our report, and for those who have the report available, about page 214 onwards, that discussion starts. So we recognise that in structure, each model has its strengths and weaknesses, and we also want to explore whether there should be more than one structural option that suits local circumstances. We've heard very clearly that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. So we will be working over the next couple of 3 months to bring together our ideas around this and present our further thinking in the final report. Next slide, please. In addition to the system design and structure, we've thought a bit about what we're calling system stewardship and support. We think there needs to be a greater level of consideration to the stewardship function that ensures local government's long-term health and well-being. In terms of local government stewardship, there are already a number of players that have roles within the system, including the Minister of Local Government, Department of Internal Affairs, the Secretary of Local Government, which is the Chief Executive of the Department of Internal Affairs. There's the Local Government Commission, Local Government New Zealand, and Taituara, which represents the executive and staff view. We need to build we need to build and support a stronger local government stewardship system that actively promotes and cares for local government, including considering such things as oversight and monitoring of the whole system's health, including the legislative provisions. Needs to also consider the care for the system's long-term capability and care for its people within it. It needs to consider the maintenance and enhancement of institutional knowledge and innovation, and it needs to encourage and support partnerships, co-design, and importantly, innovation. So thinking about the whole of the local government system as part of our review terms of reference, and we've posed some questions and are doing some thinking as as we move to our final report about how best to support the system as a whole. What is clear to us is that many of these issues, each of them is significant in its own right, that Gail and I have talked about today. Taken in combination, they may seem too hard to start, but it's too hard to start. However, in our mind, there are opportunities for doing things differently today. We can think about how councils work with communities. We think about how partnering can be given best effect to, how strong, authentic, totality-based relationships can be built. Many of those things can be done without waiting for legislation to change, and we're encouraging local government and others to be thinking about what are the things that they can do right now to change the way in which they operate. How do they deliver greater value for their community, and how do they ensure that community has a strong voice and has local government that it can trust and is there to support and enable communities to be their very best. So in the last few minutes, Gail and I have just given a bit of a thumbnail of our report, and the reality is that we could have carried on probably for another half an hour or an hour quite easily talking about the details. So we've given a very light once over, but hopefully that gives you sufficient context to be able to ask some questions. We're really interested in hearing your views. And I'm now going to pass back to Janine, who's going to lead a question and answer session for us. Janine.
Kia ora, Jim, and we've had some wonderful questions rolling on through. So the first question I'm going to put perhaps to you, Jim, is why are the 5 questions from the interim report not directly addressed in the draft report? And the team may be able to bring up a slide that shows those 5 questions. While they do, I'll just quickly remind you of those. How should the system of local governance be reshaped so it can adapt to future challenges? What are the future functions, roles and essential features of New Zealand's system of local government? How might a system of local governance embody authentic partnership under Te Tiriti o Waitangi? What needs to change so local government and its leaders can best reflect and respond to the communities they serve? And what should change in local governance funding and financing to ensure viability and sustainability, fairness and well-being? And the person who has asked the question suggests that perhaps number 3 has been directly addressed, but not the others.
Okay, thank you for that question. And perhaps in terms of thinking as a panel, it's evolved over the time of our review. We're more than 18 months through our work, and our interim report prepared in September 2021, as it was then, brought together pretty much our understanding of what the terms of reference were and enabled us to reflect on what we thought were the key lines of inquiry we needed to pursue. And as Janine read out, those 5 areas or lines of inquiry are things that we've built on, and we've continued to build and grow on that. I think our draft report is our next iteration of our thinking, and has picked each of those issues up, perhaps not directly as questions, but they are certainly woven through the draft report and the issues. Some of them more clearly, I would acknowledge, more clearly than others, but they're there. And as we move to our final report, and as our building of our thinking goes, we will probably look to reframe those even further. So I suppose it's a bit of an evolution over the last 18 months of the panel's thinking.
Kia ora, Jim, thank you. Penny, one for you around deliberative democracy. Did the panel consider making deliberative democracy a mandated part of local government processes?
Yeah, gosh, what a good question. And it's always tempting to reach straight, for making things a law or making them mandatory. I'm not convinced, and I don't think the panel is convinced, that making it mandatory is necessarily the answer. However, we are looking at recommendations in our final report that express really clearly the importance and the opportunity of using deliberative democracy and ensuring that the conditions that are enabled within the way that local government operates to utilise better methods of democracy are there. In other words, unwinding some of the large convoluted and complex issues around how LTPs and how designate consultation can be unwound so that deliberative democracy can be used far more effectively. It'll be really interesting to get people's feedback, and we'd like to know what are the strengths and weaknesses of making this a mandatory process.
And that was
if I could quickly add, sorry, Janine, that we have talked to people in Australia about the case in Victoria where it was put into legislation for local government, and there have been some interesting learnings from that, and what we're aiming towards is real quality examples of deliberative democracy and the capability and capacity to do this growing. So as Penny said, we're sort of grappling with how to make sure that this gets embedded in the most effective way possible. But rest assured, we've looked at these things and also connected to people who've been working in the OECD and have lots of experience of the hundreds of examples of this now across the world, and we've drawn on all their wisdom and experience.
Kia ora, Gail, and both of you led perfectly to the next question, which was, is there a role for this in addressing controversial issues such as climate change and retreat?
Gosh, I think a couple of us might like to crack at this too. This is absolutely, I guess, where this form of democracy comes into its own, and looking at the work that's being done in the Wellington region with Ngāti Toa, looking at a deliberative democracy process a participatory democracy process to look at the future of climate change decision making and intergenerational responsibility. It's exactly the kind of process that leads to better and more acceptable long-term solutions than referenda or some of the public meetings and town hall meetings that pass for democracy now. I think it's absolutely the only way that we're going to get long-term sensible decision making around climate change, relocation issues, coastal inundation solutions, and even things as simple as urban density debates.
Kia ora. Can I maybe put this one to Antoine? Is there international precedence for mixed representation elected and appointed overseas?
Yeah, good question. And I was looking through the question list, and I saw that one, so I had a quick look at some of the documents. I've been privileged enough to have a look at the international research. From my reckoning, there's at least 13 countries across the OECD that use a mixture of appointments and elections. They are variable. In some jurisdictions, the appointments are at a very high level, so at a sort of a governor level. So we don't probably have a commiserate for a governor type of arrangements. But some very specific ones are Netherlands, where they actually appoint mayors, which is interesting. They've got a very large number of mayors, if people are aware of the Netherlands. And then you've got places like Norway, which have appointment processes for very specific regional functions in expert committees. So there's lots of examples internationally, but the ones that I'm thinking most specifically that are relevant to New Zealand and overseas is in business, where it's quite normal to have shareholders electing members to the board, as well as some appointments of particular skills or expertise that are required, and also diversity as well. So you see in business, it's quite dynamic and diverse in terms of both election and appointment processes.
Excellent, thank you. Gail, one for you that you might will be close to your heart. Reforms like this will take time to implement. What changes can be made now to address urgent needs?
I think anything that's a local priority can be addressed now by just working differently, thinking differently, using all the assets and levers and strengths of local government right now, whether it's dealing with local climate change impact or economic challenges in a community. So it's just I guess it's the will and the imagination to get stuck in and do it. And this is definitely something that we've heard many times during this review. What's getting in the way of local government making some of these changes now? Because as Jim said, much of it can be done without legislative change or the reform. And I guess what we're trying to do is provide some of those examples, some inspiration and some putting some energy into this so that those green shoots of the future now actually increase and more local government gets stuck in and starts to reinvent its own future.
Kia ora, Gail. Brendan, one for you. What's the panel's view on the ongoing reforms, Three Waters and resource management, and are they aligned with principles talked about in the draft report like subsidiarity?
Thanks, Janine, and thanks for the question. If you have a look at our terms of reference, we were expressly required to not comment on the policy merits or otherwise of Three Waters and RM. Having said that, we've been able to try and anticipate the impacts and the direction of travel that they are taking. So what, we're trying to sort of navigate that carefully, as you might imagine. So we are trying to think in some of our recommendations and design and structure and stewardship of the system, how could we anticipate and align with how some of those reforms might play out? So you can expect to see in the final report some reflection of that. And certainly we'd be grateful for any thoughts as to how that can be done most effectively.
All right, thank you. Now we'll just go to the next question, which is rather a long one, so I'm just going to find it in the list. Okay, everything that you've all said about the role, function, structure, etc. of local government sound very sensible and positive. Thank you. But also to be completely at odds with the evident views of central government, which has commissioned the review, as local government is stripped of its main roles and functions, including in drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, resource management, regional planning, spatial planning, public transport, etc., all of which are to be centralised. How is this to be squared? Will there be anything left of local government to reform? Jim, would you like to attempt an answer at that one?
Yeah, thanks, Janine, and thank you for the question and observation. And it's one that has been passed to us on a number of occasions as we've toured the country, people concerned that what is left for local government to do. And we think the opportunity is significant for local government to actually reimagine how it delivers its role. And at the moment, again, without, as Brendan said, commenting on the policy merits of those reform agendas, if we think about the trend that is probably signalled in that, particularly around Three Waters, which is local government having less emphasis on services to property, i.e. the Three Waters functions, we see it an opportunity to be investing more in people, more in well-being. So the well-being of people and well-being of communities, thinking about the significant challenges that our communities are facing, and then think about what role local government play in enabling and ensuring that those challenges, opportunities in many cases, and outcomes that are being sought, how does local government use and leverage its resources, its place, and importantly, ensuring that local government is at place and is connected to its community and delivering what its community needs and advocating for its community are really important roles. So we see that local government needs to have more meaningful engagement with central government, in particular about the issues that are absolutely critical at place, and local government playing a significant role in actually addressing those matters, as I said, whether that's climate change, whether it's social and economic equity challenges, matters of social cohesion, issues about creating great places for people to live. They're all things that we think local government can do more of and should do more of, should be more involved with in partnership. So it's understandable to think about the glass being half empty, but we actually think a reorientation will create the opportunity for local government to reimagine what its new role is, that it's focused strongly on community, focused strongly on people, and focused strongly on the environment. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Antoine, one for you. How will tino rangatiratanga be given effect?
That's a good question. I suppose if I was being perfectly honest, I'm not quite sure how it may be expressed, certainly by local government, but I think that our main thrust of our report is being able to enable it to occur. And so for enabling that to occur, 1, there has to be a conversation, 2, there has to be a trusted relationship, and 3, there needs to be enablement, like resourced and have the conditions for it to succeed. So we've proposed a legislative framework that clarifies local government's role as part of the kawana, and iwi and hapu's particular role in expressing rangatiratanga. And that needs to start with a conversation about what does that mean in a local context. You know, we're very wary that one size does not fit all, that a centralised top-down approach will unlikely be appropriate in local circumstances, and so it'll be different in different places. So probably not a direct answer to the question, but that's the approach that we're taking.
Kia ora. Brendan, what accountability and cooperation mechanisms need to be in place to ensure that place-based regional structures will work well for communities?
So the first part, what accountability?
What accountability and cooperation mechanisms need to be in place to ensure that all place-based regional structures will work for communities?
Now, I'm presuming this is referring to, the broader arrangements, which is your central government, local government, and potentially iwi structures or arrangements. If it is, let me sort of address it in that context. So at the moment, yes, there's an attempt to put in place some sort of regional public service arrangements, which are probably early green shoots of stronger partnership and cooperation, but we only see it as the beginning of what could be a much more effective and stronger mechanism to build partnership between central and local. And yes, we acknowledge it has to have accountability mechanisms, but what we're focusing on is at least suggesting, and our recommendations will be taking the shape, there needs to be a priority setting process which acknowledges the differences from region to region. It acknowledges the local context, whether that's how climate change is being dealt with or what the housing environment might be, and that has to be done in a fairly measured and structured way between the parties, determining regional priorities, determining where investment goes, and then measuring the effectiveness of that and holding both central government and local government to account for the delivery against, the measurements, the efforts, the programs, the funding that goes into trying to tackle those priorities. I'm not sure whether that's answered the question, but hopefully that's the direction that the query was heading.
I think we can just try to take the questions in the intent that we think that they are meaning, and we'll do our best to answer them. And if not, you can put another question in there, and if we don't get to it, we'll make sure we answer it later for you. Can I refer one, maybe we'll shed around a bit. Penny, have you got a view around whether councils are too small, or have you concluded as a panel that councils are too small to deliver the sort of services expected? And do you recommend merging some of these smaller councils?
This is probably the one issue that we've grappled with the most. I'll tackle it from the root of where the discussion comes from. Is this an amalgamation agenda review? And it certainly isn't. We're looking at what conditions can be put in place to allow councils to operate in the way that best allows them to give full voice to their capability, their ability to be agile, to work closely with their community and deliver well-being in the way that works for their specific communities. Does this mean that all councils need to carry on as they are? Is the status quo kind of where we're heading? It isn't. I think Jim in his introduction made it really clear that to deal with the complex mega challenges that we're facing, there are going to have to be some changes to councils. So we're looking at what we need to reshape about the system rather than what we need to reshape about individual councils themselves. We would like to make it easier if councils do choose to work more collaboratively for them to do so. And if that means that councils may choose to eventually amalgamate, that's, you know, if they see that as being best for their communities, that's fine. But we're looking far more closely at conditions for success than we are in structural amalgamation reform. Our, you know, maybe Jim or want to pick up the structural options that we're looking at that still allow for that small, intimate and local to be given effect to.
Perhaps if I could just build on Penny's invitation, keeping local in local government is something that we've heard loud and clear, and that's really important. You know, people live in places, and while many live in large metropolitans, a number live in everybody lives in their own community, and having a sense of community, having a sense of place, the importance of that, and feeling like you have a connection to your place as well, an identity that and an affiliation, that is all important to us as social animals. So we want to retain the best of that and keep local in local government, and you won't find the word amalgamation in our draft report, I don't believe. But it doesn't mean that we're going to suggest that everything should stay the same either. But how do you ensure, and that is a real bottom line, how do we ensure that we keep local and community strong and supported while having the capacity and capability to deliver on some of these gnarly challenges and to be able to partner effectively with others to deliver on the wellbeing challenges. So I think there's, you know, there is some tension in the conversation, and we are having many conversations as a panel about how that should look and be, and we're really genuinely interested in the feedback we're going to receive about that. Whichever model is, or models, because it may not be one model, whichever models are adopted, they need to ensure those principles that I talked about earlier about being local, about subsidiarity, that they need to sit core in place while ensuring that the organisations that support place have the capacity to do what's needed and what is right.
Thank you. One for Brendan. Do you envisage the local government stewardship function to have agency over the role of central government in its partnership with local government? Shifting the relationship to one of partnership will be challenging given the current hierarchical approach. Having a steward overseeing local government in some ways reinforces the concept of local government being subservient to central government unless the stewardship has authority over central government too.
Yeah, look, that's a really important issue, and one that we've been grappling with a lot to try and find the balance. We acknowledge there's a power imbalance that's very evident, and some of that is reflected in behaviours. Some of it is reflected in the legislation, which is really quite prescriptive. So what we are trying to do with some of our considerations and recommendations is to even that out and to reset that relationship. We may get submissions around suggesting different constitutional status for local government, which would be also relevant to the question of stewardship. So I guess it remains to be seen exactly where that lands. But what we are trying to do, as I said, is to think about how the relationship can be put on a more even footing. I think there's a combination of things that can be done in the short term to help address that. Some of it is around the priority setting and the funding. Some of it is around, you know, who has say where and when, what is the accountability model that goes with it. But I think as long as you have a system at the moment that is largely driven on its current legislative footing, that is only going to probably reinforce that power imbalance. And one of the recommendations that we have made is to look at the legislation and to look at how it can be constructed in a more enabling, less prescriptive way. However, one of the things that's quite relevant to that, which is inherent in the current relationship, is a lack of trust. So, there's the legislation reflects it, as do many of the behaviours. So how do we build trust? And one of the things that we're suggesting is closer working together at place, setting priorities and tackling challenges that are relevant in particular locations where you've got central government, local government and iwi teaming up together to do that.
Kia ora. This one's directed at Penny, but it might be a tag team of Penny and Gail on this one, both our Auckland-based panel members. The question is, how well do the recommendations address Auckland's challenges like transport, housing affordability and environmental challenges? Penny?
Yeah, I think this might be a tag team. When you sit on a panel like this, you can't help but bring your own experiences to the table. And I have to be really honest, it's hard not to look at all the proposals that are put forward and go, how will this help make Auckland better? So, the proposals that we're coming up with and the discussions that we're having do attempt to deal with some of these thorny issues. So, thinking about environmental, what will make environmental outcomes better. This is where we're trying to balance the small, the local, the intimate, and the communities needing to make decisions for themselves versus the regional issues, the regulatory issues that are so critical when you look at environmental stewardship. Our panel is endeavouring to deal with those complexities and balance them. Where I see, things perhaps being better for Auckland in some of our proposals, we are acknowledging that perhaps the amalgamation wasn't put together with communities in mind, that it was put together for so-called ease of relationship with central government, and the panel's learned a lot of lessons from that. We're putting the well-being of communities at the heart of the way that we're constructing our review. So, long end game, hopefully what we come up with will address some of those problems for Auckland. The very, very big question is, does Auckland become part of a nationwide review, or does Auckland stay separate? And some of us have our own personal ideas that we would like to see Auckland reviewed as part of this process. So I don't know if Gail wishes to add.
I don't think I can add anything to that fantastic response, Penny. Agree with you.
Thank you both. I apologise. I understand there's some feedback issues coming from me with my mic on, so I'll try and keep it off when others are speaking. We have a few engagement targeted questions, which I will put the first one to Jim. Who is the target audience of the report?
Thanks, Janine. So the target audience of the report, and another good question. Perhaps just start by outlining, in terms of the terms of reference, we as a panel, our final report is to be presented concurrently to the Minister of Local Government and Local Government New Zealand. And they have both agreed that post our review, that there will be a working party that considers our recommendations. And I think it's important to note that our report is a report that is a review. It is not a reform. So if any of our recommendations are to be taken forward, and it's our sincere hope they are, then that will need a process beyond our final report. We hope that this is an opportunity, as we've said, it's a once in a generation opportunity to rethink local government, and both through our engagement to date, and we hope through submissions and the final, that there is a wide interest in this. One of the things which we are, saddened by, is the fact that the relevance of local government to many in communities is less than it should be, and we see local government as truly a critical and fundamental part of the democracy model and the system that supports and enables communities and well-being. And perhaps for citizens of New Zealand, we perhaps take local government for granted a bit, whether it's all of the services and delivery. We would love communities to be, and people within it, and there are citizens who are really dead keen to be more involved in local local government, local decision making, contributing to well-being, but are frustrated by the current processes. So if we can make the processes better, simple, more enabling and easier for people to engage, and that they see that when they do engage, their view makes a difference, then ultimately we see our report as being for the betterment of all citizens and all communities. And hopefully if our recommendations are taken up on, which we sincerely hope they are, then all people will see value and benefit from our report.
Thank you, Jim. Now, I understand that we have one of our participants who's raised their hand and wanted to ask a question live, and for accessibility reasons, we do want to be able to support people who cannot use the other options. So I'm going to ask the team to allow Charlotte to ask a question. Kia ora, Charlotte. Can you hear us, Charlotte? Your mute may be on. Your mute button may be on, Charlotte. Okay, the hand has come down. So maybe we just had a hand up, an error there. So I'll ask the team to take us back to the panel. Well, I think we've really only got time for one more question now. So I'm going to ask, I'll ask this of Jim, and then we can wind up after that. What role does private sector investment play in local government funding and finance? Is there scope for more direct involvement of private capital to plug the funding gaps?
Thank you. We in our report have identified opportunities to broaden the range of funding and finance that is available. Obviously, finance, i.e. loans, that is secured significantly through private sector investment in bonds and other such mechanisms which support local government financing. In terms of direct funding, our draft report does talk about the potential for contributions to be made from individuals, and to some extent we see that now through sponsorship, through benevolent bequests and other such arrangements, and some entities are actually now thinking about how do they invest in well-being and are prepared to make a contribution. We would love to see, particularly when we take a missions-based approach to the matters that are of great concern or need for communities, where many people can make a contribution to addressing a major challenge within a community. It doesn't all have to be local government. There are others who currently do, and we would love to see more of others putting their contribution in. And it may not necessarily be direct dollar contribution, but there are whole different ways of contributing resources, thinking and energy into activities that benefit communities. So it's probably more in that way rather than going to particular private sector entities and subsidising rates per se, other than they already are captured through the current rating system, of course. But there is opportunity, and we think that the basket of opportunity should be as broad as possible.
Kia ora, Jim. That brings us to the end of the Q&A session. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of your questions, but as I say, we will do that by email to all attendees. They were incredibly good questions, really insightful and thoughtful, and I'm sure the panels really enjoyed responding to some of those questions, and they've provoked further food for thought. So thank you. It's been great reading through those questions. Where to next? So the panel is continuing to deliberate over its final recommendations for the report, noting that they won't make any final recommendations until they've had a chance to consider the submissions. So another opportunity to plug those submissions. Please get them in. The panel really wants your input. And if you can get them in earlier, great, because the panel would love to be able to read them as time goes on. There is a very tight window. The submissions period was allowed as long as we could, but the report production necessities mean that window is quite short. And so the report is due on the 19th of June. And again, look forward to those submissions. I'm going to ask Jim to make some closing comments before Antoine closes us with a karakia.
Kia ora, thank you, Janine, and thank you to everybody who has joined this webinar today, and thank you for the great questions. Really, really valuable and thought-provoking, and you can see in the responses they certainly challenge the panel, and that's great. We really want those great questions, great ideas fed into us to test our thinking and to enable us to explore deeper and further. So thank you so much for being with us today. As Janine said, once submissions close on the 28th of February, we will be intent on reading them all and understanding the key great ideas that come through and finalise our report by mid-June. So that is certainly our focus as a panel. And again, thank you for your time today. And if I can now pass to Antoine to close.
Yeah, but perhaps this is a question for you, Janine. I've been looking through all the questions, and I know we haven't answered all of them. Some of them are really good questions. So are we going to get back to them by email individually, are we, or to the group?
No, we'll get back to the whole group. So we'll formulate a summary of the questions that weren't asked and the answers, and that will go out to all attendees.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Hui anō he mihi kawana ki koutou, kua tai mai nei tēnei rā ki te whakawhitinga kōru e pāna ki te arota ki te anamata mō ngā kaunihero Aotearoa, ko the future of local government. Anō reira, he karaki hei whakakapi a tātou hui. Ko te pū, ko te mori, ko te weu, ko te aka, ko te rea. Ko te wao nui, ko te kone, ko te whē, ko te kore, ko te pō nui, ko te pō roa, ko te pō tangatango ki te whai au ki te ao marama. Ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, tui ata ka wai tangata e heke mai Hawaiki, Hawaiki nui, Hawaiki roa, Hawaiki pāmamau. I hono ki te wairua ki te whai au ki te ao marama, ti hei, Māori ora. Kia ora whānau.